Welcome to the Kansas Forest Service podcast, the podcast that tells the unique stories of the men and women dedicated to forestry and wildland fire in Kansas. Welcome to episode 9 of the Kansas Forest Service podcast. I'm your host, Cassie Wondersea, and today I have Dr. Charlie Barden with me, who is a professor of forestry and extension forester at Kansas State University. So thanks so much for being on, Charlie.
You bet. Thanks, Cassie, for inviting me.
Yeah, happy to have you. So, Charlie, can you tell me a little bit about what it is you do as a professor of forestry and the extension forester at Kansas State?
Sure. The extension part of it is the slogan for K-State Research Extension is knowledge for life. We try to bring the university to the people who need the information out across the state. Other parts of extension do that for the cattle farmers or the wheat farmers, the ranchers, and I try to do that for the woodland owners and natural resource agencies that are managing our woodlands and wildlife. And I have a great partner in the Kansas Forest Service. We do lots of joint programming and workshops and field tours, working with the Kansas Forest Service staff.
Mm-hmm. So, Charlie, I know we get the question a lot from the public. Well, maybe more bewilderment of the statement of, well, you have forest in Kansas. So, what's been your experience with that, with the public or working with different agencies?
Right. A lot of people don't realize that we do have many different types of forests in Kansas. They don't cover a whole mountainside like you might see in Colorado, or cover a whole valley like you might see further east. But there are actually many different types of forests here in Kansas, or more correctly called woodlands here in Kansas. And there's 5 or 6 different types of native types of woodlands, like the oak hickory forest, which we see in northeast Kansas, is a very similar forest, goes all the way to the east coast. And then we have the pin oak and pecan woodlands in the wetlands in the riverside areas of southeast Kansas. We have a cottonwood and elm forest, throughout the rivers running all the way to the western part of the state. So we've got a number of native natural woodland types, forest types in the state. And added to those, we have many different types of trees that we've planted that are really categorized more by their function on the landscape than by what kind of trees are in them. And by those, we mean things like windbreaks and shelter belts, riparian buffers along our streams, walnut or pecan plantations for nuts and timber production, and even Christmas tree plantations. We think about this time of year are kind of a specialized type of forest stand that we grow here in Kansas.
Mm-hmm. So of those different types of forests and woodlands, which is your favorite?
My favorite is probably the oak hickory type, because that's the type I grew up with, growing up in southern New England and Rhode Island. And that type of woodland has a lot of value for wildlife with the nuts it produces. It helps the deer and the turkey kind of fatten up and get through the cold winter. And we used to heat our home with firewood, with wood back home. And we'd always, try to cut mostly oak and hickory because it was the high density, most efficient firewood to deal with.
So what is it about forestry, and specifically forestry in Kansas, that drew you here from Rhode Island?
Yeah, I always had an interest in nature, and part of nature was the woodlands. I said the family activities growing up, we'd visit a lot of the national parks in the eastern U.S. and go on the guided nature hikes and that sort of thing. I was just really interested in forestry and wildlife management. And then when I was finishing up my PhD, the job became available here in Kansas. The first time after my PhD, I came out to Oklahoma and worked there for a few years. We moved back to Pennsylvania, and then the K-State job came up as a tenure track faculty member and extension forester, working with the Forest Service agency, and it just looked really attractive. So we moved here back in 1998 and have stayed ever since.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kansas is, once you get here, people tend to stick around for a little while.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about your role as an extension forester and the ways that you work with agents or with district foresters,
Mm-hmm.
and getting that information out to the public.
Sure. The county agents are usually the first line of questions that people will call them about their tree questions, whether it's a sick tree in their yard or whether they've heard that they want to start a Christmas tree plantation. What do they need to know to do that successfully? or they may just have a question about, is this tree a hazard in my yard? And usually the county agent or the district forester can answer those questions directly. And then if it's something they're not familiar with, or they know I've done some research on it, then they will give me a call or an email and say, hey, what do you think about this situation? Can you talk to this landowner? So I don't go out and do the direct landowner visits that the district foresters would help develop a stewardship plan or like that. But I kind of back up as a specialist with some additional information if they need it.
Mm-hmm. And you're involved quite a bit with forestry research. Is that correct?
Right. I usually run about 3 to 4 graduate students at a time, and we're doing different types of research projects. My students right now are studying the effect of windbreaks on crop yields and seeing if there's a positive or negative effect on protecting a field with windbreaks. That's kind of the second phase of a study we've done for a number of years in that area. Another interesting one we're doing is down in the McConnell Air Force Base. We're looking at stream bank stabilization with willows and red cedar revetments and that sort of thing to reduce erosion. And then the third student is working with the Native American tribes to improve vegetable production and diet on the reservations here in Kansas. And I've worked quite a few years with the Potawatomi and Kickapoo tribes. And so that's it's in vegetables, not really in forestry, but it takes advantage of my special relationship with the tribes that we could work closely with them.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the work and the research you do really focuses on the ways that those woodlands and forests really help improve Kansas, whether it's conservation or providing that woodland habitat for animals and whatnot. What is it about that you find interesting or satisfying?
Well, I like the applied nature of it. Some research is very, very basic. They discover something at the molecular level, but it's not something that's going to be applied very quickly to life or to most people. But I really like the applied nature of, we can figure out what the yield is on that field and what the windbreak is doing. And should the windbreak be narrowed to make it more efficient or add another row, we can actually, solve people's problems and make a more efficient operation by managing the woodlands correctly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We see a lot of windbreaks, here in Kansas, especially along those croplands or along homes. As people are thinking about establishing a windbreak or looking at some options on using their woodlands for conservation, what some of that or as they're looking at using windbreaks for conservation purposes, what's some of the guidance that you might provide folks or give them some things to think about with that?
Right. There's usually some type of cost share or technical assistance available that the Kansas Forest Service can go out and help kind of design the windbreak and walk the land with the landowner to recommend where they would plant trees and how to do it. And depends on what they want out of that windbreak. They're trying to shelter the homesteads. They want to real attract the windbreaks. When they look out their window, they can have a different view. Or is it just something along a crop field where you just need 2 rows of trees to break up that wind and help protect the crops? So it kind of depends on what the landowner's objectives are as to how we would design the planting for them.
So with the research that you're doing, where is a lot of that that money like being funded through? Is that through grants that you're applying, or how does
Right,
that work?
different grants and proposals I write. The windbreak study is being funded by the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, USDA. The first phase of it was funding from the U.S. Forest Service and the National Agroforestry Center, where we did the crop yield windbreak study, and then the NRCS liked the results of that, wanted us to expand it, so they provided us some additional funding. We can bring in a new student, visit new farms and collect more data in that area.
Mm-hmm. So what is it about that the conservation aspect of woodlands in Kansas that you're really drawn to?
Right. Well, the thing is, the state only has 5% woodlands acreage or 7% of woodland cover if you count trees in cities and like that. But it's that 5 to 7%, which is really important. Other states, back in part of where I grew up in Maine, they're 90% forested. So if they lost 1% of their forest, it wouldn't be a big deal. But here in Kansas, with 5% forested, if we lose 1% forest, that's 1 out of 5 trees. That's 20% of our woodland cover, we have a big impact. And so I found that where we have fewer trees, they need to be valued a little bit more highly. The few trees we have in a thin strip growing along a creek or stream edge really helps hold that stream bank in place during a flood. As floodwaters get up and expand, those few trees along the edge of the bank help stop the log jams and flotsam and jetsam that's coming down the floodwaters that gets held within the riparian areas. So they're spreading out over the road or over the farmers' fields. The roots help hold the soil during erosion. The trees on small creeks and streams are shading the water and keeping it cooler, which makes it a healthier, better environment for fish and other aquatic life. So there might be just a thin row of trees along that stream, but they're doing lots of different functions out there in the landscape. My elevator speech, I always say I try to use trees to solve environmental problems. When people say, "What do you do in Kansas with trees?" Well, I use trees to solve environmental problems, whether it's for a windbreak or a riparian area or just what it is that needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting way to think about it in the terms of, since we have a smaller tree resource, there's a greater need there to protect it. I'd never thought of it in that way. And I'm gonna have to start using that. Use trees to solve environmental problems. And, I think we tend to hear that joke quite a bit of when we're out and about throughout the country of, well, if you're here, who's watching the one tree that you have in Kansas? And it's like, well, we take turns watching it and this is my week off. So,
right. Yeah. When I first went to the American Forest National Convention, I saw some of my old friends who were in Maine, and they were, make fun of, what kind of forest do you do out in Kansas? And I had to let them know that one individual black walnut tree that we grow in Kansas is worth a whole acre of spruce and fir pulpwood that they're so proud of managing in Maine and turning it into paper towels and toilet paper. I said, one of our trees is worth more than your whole acre of pulp coming off it. So
we'll have to make sure that
there.
Yeah, we'll have to make sure we send the podcast to them so they can get a listen in on it. So, so when you're thinking of Kansas and the woodlands, what are those values to people? We don't have that typical timber industry where we're making toilet paper and paper towels. So what's the human value there?
Right. The human value is usually people just enjoy walking in their woods. They may enjoy bird watching. They may just like the fact that they can see a deer sometimes walk along the edge of their woods. Whether they're a hunter or not, they just enjoy seeing wildlife and knowing they try to kind of a home for wildlife. You look at the real estate ads, and if there's a section of timber on the landowner on the land that's being offered for sale, they really tout that in the real estate ad. So that that woodland has some value for people, and people value an area that has some woodlands on it.
And what are some steps that people can take to help keep their woodlands healthy, or to really think about improving the timber stand that they do have?
One of the biggest threats we have right now in the eastern part of the state is bush honeysuckle. It's an invasive understory shrub that looks pretty. It keeps its bright green leaves come out early in late March, and they stay green until mid-November, and they have these pretty red berries. People wonder, what's that pretty little bush growing in the understory? Well, it's this bush honeysuckle, which can be very invasive, and it can make a dense understory underneath the native trees and choke out the wildflowers and the regeneration and the seedlings of the next generation of trees you like coming. So that's probably one of the biggest threats, is check to see if you have bush honeysuckle in your eastern Kansas woodlands. It seems like most of the counties that have a pretty good sized city in them, from Manhattan, Riley County, and on down, they have some bush honeysuckle already well established and lots of woodlands in the county.
Yeah, I know, just even driving through Manhattan, I tend to see quite a bit of it here as well in town.
Yeah, so that's where it started from. It was an ornamental that they sold from nurseries to people planting in their yard, and it's a pretty shrub. There's no getting around it. But they started there in people's backyards, so the woodlands right next to the cities are just covered with bush honeysuckle, and it gets a little bit thinner as it gets further and further out into the rural landscape. But if it's a homeowner listening to this podcast who's got 5, 10, 20 acres, fairly close to a larger town, they probably have some bush honeysuckle. They may want to survey it, and if they do some control of it.
And what might some of those control options be?
Usually the only way to be effective with it is herbicide, carefully applying chemical. There's several different methods you can use. You can spray Roundup in late fall. when the honeysuckle still has green leaves and the other native trees do not. So the Roundup just goes in through the green tissue and kills or greatly weakens the bush honeysuckle. One of the techniques I've used on my own property is to use a mix of diesel fuel and herbicide to spray the bases of the stems any time of year, really, but fall and winter is a good time to do it, where you just apply herbicide in the diesel oil, and the oil penetrates the bark and carries the chemical in with it and kills back the shrub that way.
Mm-hmm. So I think for me, bush honeysuckle brings up a perfect example of a well-intentioned planting that has tended to gone awry. Because please
Right.
correct me if I'm wrong. That's an exotic invasive that was brought into the country.
Right. It came from Asia, from Japan and Korea, like that. And it's a beautiful shrub, beautiful flowers in the honeysuckle family, bright red berries in the fall. But if it would just stay where we put it, that'd be great. But the birds eat those berries and pass those seeds out all over the place, and you get new shrubs coming. And if you just cut it down, it resprouts really vigorously. It just gets thicker if you cut it down. So you can't just cut it and hope to control it that way.
So are there other examples of invasive or damaging plants, but like woody shrubs or trees that are having the same effect as Asian bush honeysuckle?
Right. That's probably the worst one in the woodlands. We see some Serratia lesbidesia coming into new plantings or new riparian or field plantings. We'll take advantage of that area. But in the woodlands, I think that's really the worst one.
Mm-hmm. And how, as we're having this conversation, how do people balance the selection of those plant materials? It's something that, even here with the Kansas Forest Service, we're looking at different species now of trees that might not be native in this area that will deal better with some of these changing conditions that we have in climate. So what are kind of your thoughts there on that native versus non-native species selection?
Yeah, I don't discriminate that hard against the non-natives as some folks do. We've lost most of our big elms through Dutch elm disease. We're losing our ash in eastern Kansas with emerald ash borer. And so if we have a replacement species for some of those that wasn't born here in the U.S., I'm fine with that. We just need to be careful. They aren't going to be really invasive species like a lesbidesia or Serratia or the bush honeysuckle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, is there really a good way to know how invasive those might be before we start recommending that we plant them here?
That's always the catch. We've only thought about species being invasive really the last 10 or 15 years. Before that, if it grew well, hey, let's plant it and use it. And only recently we said, well, it grows too well, we better not plant that because it'll escape on us. But you have to look at where the species came from, how well adapted it will be to Kansas. Like we won't ever have a bush honeysuckle problem in western Kansas because it just doesn't like drought and low rainfall that we get further out west. But in the eastern half of Kansas, from about Salina east, it can be a real problem.
So that's probably another area too where maybe circling back around to those different woodland and forest types that you talked about as we started the podcast, like having an understanding of what those forest types are could really help you with some of those management decisions or looking at your planning there for plantings and whatnot.
Right, looking at what kind of trees grow well in that area. And we've done a number of different woodland surveys and riparian surveys. And even if hackberry wasn't the major species in the overstory, it tends to dominate the regeneration because it grows well in the shade of other trees. So in addition to controlling the bush honeysuckle, sometimes we need to really work hard to get back our oak and hickory and our more valuable species back, and our walnuts. If we just cut those large oaks and walnuts, with nothing but hackberry will come up underneath them. And hackberry, it's a nice tree, but it doesn't have much timber value, and it doesn't produce a big seed and nut crop for wildlife to fatten up for the winter. So it's kind of has some limitations.
Yeah, see, Charlie, I'm the opposite. I think hackberry is an absolute junk tree. They are surrounding my house. They're all along our creek. I could spend weeks with a chainsaw cutting them, and I don't think I would get through even just a little bit of what's there.
Well, I didn't want to be too harsh with them, but they just don't have the value that some other species do. But if we don't do anything, that's the trend line that the woodlands are going to, is dominated by hackberry. What we see mostly hackberry and elm in the understory is seedlings and saplings, and the elms start to drop out with Dutch elm disease, and the hackberry just keeps growing and getting bigger and shading out everything else.
Now, do you think that there's a possibility that that hackberry eventually might balance itself out as well, or is it going to maintain and continue to be that more dominant species?
Yeah, that is a good question. The ecological theory used to be, the climax forest they talked about. The one that's most famous is the beech birch maple forest of Canada and northeast U.S., where those species, American beech, uh, uh, yellow birch, and sugar maple, also shade tolerant. They can reproduce in the shade of themselves, and so once they quote capture a site, an old beech tree falls over, new beech trees take their place because nothing else was growing there as a climax forest. I don't know if hackberry would quite be a climax forest here in Kansas because it's never been left alone long enough for that to happen. A fire will come along, a harvesting comes along and sets it back and gets more sunlight in there, so the faster growing oaks and black walnut get established. But that could be what's going to happen. Some of these areas will become hackberry woodlands and stay that way for a couple of hundred years, because remember, trees can live a long time. So they don't have to reproduce underneath themselves, but once they capture the site, they can dominate it for a couple of hundred years.
And what's kind of your thought or your train of thinking, or maybe the theory behind the human intervention there? Is that should we be intervening in those forests by going in and maybe thinning hackberries or doing that timber stand improvement?
It depends on the landowner, but I think we should. We don't need to do that on every acre and every land ownership. But if the homeowner, the landowner, is interested in oaks and walnuts and hickories, they're interested in wildlife and feeding those wildlife, they'll want to try to perpetuate that oak hickory forest type in the future. And if they don't do anything, they need to realize that those oaks will eventually get old and fall over and lose vigor and be replaced by hackberry, which doesn't have the same values. So it depends on the landowner. If they're interested in maintaining those values, they need to do some management. Some of the management, national parks, don't allow cutting. They don't even, put out fires if they're naturally set and that sort of thing. They kind of let nature take its course. And that's led to some big blow-ups and big problems in some of the western forests and national parks. And so I don't think we want to do that same kind of management here in Kansas, leave it hands off until we have a real problem.
So it sounds like really the landowner is the one that can and should really dictate that forestry management based on their desired land use.
Exactly, yeah. And most of our woodlands in Kansas are owned by private woodland owners, so it's really up to them. We have some limited state park land, and we have our first Jackman State Forest down in Butler County that the Forest Service manages, but most of the woodlands are privately owned, and so decisions really rest with the landowner.
So what are some of the resources that those landowners have to help them make those decisions on the ways that they might manage those woodland resources?
Right. There's a number of good fact sheets on the Kansas Forest Service website that we can promote, that people can read about managing the woodlands for wildlife, managing the woodlands for firewood, establishing a windbreak. And if a person takes those and reads through those and kind of informs themselves, they are in a lot better shape to ask the right questions of their district forester, to make an appointment, or if they send me an email or call, and I try to find some advice over the phone that way. If they've, learned a little bit themselves, and they can ask a lot better questions and know what we're talking about.
And I know, in the past, we've always had our fall field day and walnut council meetings and all these different in-person events. And of course, COVID-19 has really made us, cancel all of it.
Right.
So, maybe we could look at doing some virtual workshops. Have you thought of trying any of those, or are there other ways for people to learn more?
Yeah, the virtual workshops would be good as Zoom meetings. We've done a few of those with the Master Gardener Group, and the National Black Walnut Council had a series of those in the fall that were quite good. And we had some Kansas woodland owners log onto those and participate. But if the coronavirus doesn't pretty much go away by spring, we need to figure out, okay, let's do a virtual workshop, do a Zoom workshop. Might not be all day thing from 9 to 3, but maybe 2 mornings from 9 to 11, and do some filming out on a woodland owner's property that we can drop in there, so they get kind of virtual field experience. So it's not just talking heads with a PowerPoint for a couple hours. But yeah, it might be something we need to look at.
Yeah, I think we may have just volunteered ourselves for that,
Uh-oh.
Charlie, inadvertently. So I'll be sure. I'll make sure I circle back around, and we'll chase down that idea a little farther. But well, Charlie, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today. Do you have any other thoughts or topics, anything that you want to share with folks?
The only thing is that talk about like working in extension. Extension is kind of a unique organization in the United States. It's supported by what's called a three-legged stool of federal funding support, and then state support and coordination through the university, and then working with the county agents, the county staff across the state. And so it's kind of a unique partnership of federal, state, and county that helps put together, have a county agent in every state, in every county. And then, of course, we enjoy working with the Kansas Forest Service and coordinating our programs with them, too.
Yeah, and definitely, I think that the county extension agents, whether it's an agriculture extension agent or horticulture extension agent, they have such a breadth of knowledge and access to professors such as yourself that have this really deeply seated knowledge in their topic areas that they can tap into. So I would encourage anyone listening to reach out to those county extension agents if you're looking for any information, whether it's agriculture or forestry related. Those are great resources there.
Right. Great place to start with, and they'll put you in touch with your district forest, or just an individual question. They might refer it to me, and I'll get back with the landowner and answer it. Yeah.
So maybe just in closing, what's the top question that you tend to get from, whether it's coming up through extension agents, from landowners? What's that top question about forestry in Kansas that you might get?
The top question would be, what's making my tree sick? We get a discolored tree or little holes in the trunk, and they'll wonder what it is. Is it a bug they can spray for? Is it damage from a bird? It's usually what's called the sick tree calls. Will be the number one. And the number two one is a sadder one. It's one where my trees are sick due to neighbors spraying their pasture for brush control. I think I got drift on my trees. They're sick. Are they going to die? What do I need to do to try to improve the health of those trees? And like that. That's the second most common question we probably get.
Yeah. And any final advice you would offer to Kansas landowners or people interested in forestry in our state?
Yeah, I would say check out the K-State and the Kansas Forest Service website. There's a lot of good information there on forestry, and call or visit with your county extension agent and get on the list to get invitations to our field days and the workshops we have. And you can learn more, and you can visit with other landowners who have done it. We have a lot of experienced landowners in the state who've done some great management and planted some excellent trees and plantations, and the people can learn a lot from each other, from fellow woodland owners.
Awesome. Well, Charlie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, we'll have to do this more often.
Sure.
We have a wealth of information there, and want to definitely keep taking advantage of that. So thank you so much.
Sounds good. We'll be glad to.